The next morning, Evelyn and Elijah's mom came in and said, "Get ready, kids, we're going to your cousin's house." And they both said, "Hooray!" They loved spending time with their cousins, Luke and Nora. When they got there, the first thing they did was play hide and seek. Elijah and Nora were the hiders, and Evelyn and Luke were the seekers, and they started counting to 10. While they were counting, Elijah and Nora couldn't figure out where to hide. They looked all over the house, and then suddenly Elijah heard Nora whisper, "Elijah, go this way." In that moment, he knew exactly where he had heard that voice before. And then he looked right at Nora and said, "Nora, were you in my dream last night?" Nora said, "I was there, but it wasn't a dream." And then right when Elijah heard that, he ran out of his hiding spot and told Evelyn. Evelyn and Elijah demanded to know how Nora knew about their dream. And Nora said, "Oh, you'll find out when the time is right." And before they could say anything back, they heard their moms call out, "Lunch!" So they all ran to the table and ate lunch, and as soon as they were finished, Luke got up and he grabbed a bag of Lifesavers candy, and when he brought one to Elijah, he said, "Grab the Lifesaver, Elijah." And Elijah remembered those words from the night before when someone pulled him to shore in the sea of whipped cream. Now Elijah and Evelyn were really confused, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And that's when Nora said, "Hey guys, come and see this fort that Luke and I made." And so they did. And when they got to the living room, they saw a great big fort built out of couch cushions. But something about it looked different than any other fort they'd ever seen before. It looked dark inside, really dark. So dark they couldn't even see inside it. "What's in there?" Evelyn said. And then Luke said, "There's only one way to find out, isn't there?" And with that, Nora held Elijah's hand and Luke held Evelyn's hand, and they said, "We're going to need a running start for this." "A running start?" Elijah said. "Why?" Before anyone could explain, Nora grabbed his hand and they ran and ran, and they closed their eyes and they jumped headfirst right into the fort. And then Luke grabbed Evelyn's hand and they got a running start, and then they jumped in right after Elijah and Nora. And what they found on the other side was something that Evelyn and Elijah never expected to see. When the kids opened their eyes, they looked around and found themselves in a dark forest. And something about the trees in this forest looked strange and yet familiar all at the same time. As they started walking through the woods, a twig snapped beneath Evelyn's foot. She reached down to pick it up, and when she looked closer, she saw that it had red and white stripes on it. This was no ordinary stick. It was a candy cane. She looked closer at the trees and saw that they were all made of candy canes too. Evelyn reached out and grabbed some of the leaves and realized that they were made of cotton candy. They were back in Candyland. And when they turned to look at Nora and Luke, they were dressed differently than they were back in the living room. Nora was wearing a royal gown and had a crown on her head made of candy. And Luke had a crown, and he was holding a scepter that looked like a great big chocolate-covered pretzel. And all the while, as they kept walking, they eventually left the woods and were heading into a small town. And some of the townspeople walked by, and they looked at Luke and Nora and said, "Good morning, Your Highness." It turned out Luke and Nora weren't just ordinary children in Candyland. They were the prince and princess of Candyland. It was Nora who had showed Elijah the way in his dream, and Luke who threw him a lifesaver and saved his life and pulled him to shore. Evelyn said, "Does this mean that you guys can do whatever you want?" And Luke said, "Pretty much." And right when they were about to walk into the center of the town, they heard a horrible laugh in the distance. It sounded so creepy. And then that laugh got louder, and it sounded like it was getting closer. And all the townspeople around them became frightened and started to run into their homes. And then they finally saw who it was. It was Lord Licorice. Lord Licorice was not a nice guy. He would run all over Candyland and turn all the candy into licorice. He could even turn children into licorice. That's one of the worst things that could ever happen. And Lord Licorice looked at the 4 children and said, "Hello, Princess Nora, and hello, Prince Luke. I see you have 2 new friends." And Luke looked up at Lord Licorice and said, "You stay away from here. You're not going to turn us or this town into licorice. You leave us alone." And Lord Licorice said, "Oh, and what if I do not? What if I take your 2 friends and turn them into licorice? They certainly look as though they'd be delicious if I turn them into licorice." And then Nora said, "You guys, run!" Luke grabbed Evelyn's hand and Nora grabbed Elijah's hand, and they just ran as fast as they could. And they heard Lord Licorice running after them. And all they could do was run and run and run. But no matter how fast they went, they heard his footsteps behind them as he was getting closer and closer. And right when Lord Licorice picked up his magical wand to turn them all into licorice, all of a sudden Nora could hear the sound of Root Beer River in the distance. And she knew exactly what they had to do. She said, "Guys, come this way," and they quickly turned, and Lord Licorice lost track of them for just a moment. But then he picked up and started running again. Nora knew that if they wanted to get home, they had to jump in that river and go over that waterfall. So they kept running as fast as they could, and they ran and ran, and all the while they heard Lord Licorice getting closer. He was so much faster than them. But as soon as they jumped in Root Beer River and the river took them away, Lord Licorice's speed wouldn't matter because he could never keep up with them once they were in that river. And so sure enough, they ran right up to the riverbank. And of course, by this time, Evelyn and Elijah knew exactly what they had to do. So the 4 of them jumped in that river, and the river swept them away. And the roaring root beer took them down the rapids as they dodged candy rocks. And they finally came to the waterfall, and they looked over the edge, and it was so far down. And so over they went, and then all 4 kids screamed and screamed as they fell, and they let go of each other's hands, and they just kept falling for what seemed like forever, until all of a sudden they went boing, 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 boing. And when the 4 children opened their eyes, they looked around, and they knew exactly where they were. They were sitting on the trampoline at Nora and Luke's house. And Nora and Luke were just dressed like normal kids again. Somehow, they went from the waterfall in Candyland to the trampoline in their backyard. Well, they had no idea how that worked. All they knew was they were glad to be out of Candyland and away from Lord Licorice so that he couldn't turn them into candy. Man, that was a lot scarier than the night before. They sure were glad to be home. And Evelyn and Elijah asked Luke and Nora, "How long have you been a princess and a prince in Candyland? How come you never told us about this?" And Nora said, "Would you really believe us if we had told you?" And they said, "Well, no, probably not. That would be kind of a crazy thing to say. But we sure believe you now because we've been there." And Luke said, "Now that you've been there, you can know, but you can't tell anyone else." And then Evelyn said, "Can we ever go there again?" And Nora said, "Of course. The next time you come to our house, we'll show you the way to get back there." But Elijah said, "But what about Lord Licorice? Won't he get us next time we go there?" And Luke said, "We have some tricks up our sleeve on how to deal with him." But what they didn't realize was that Lord Licorice had some very evil plans for Candyland. And the next time those 4 children got back to visit Candyland, they would see something that they couldn't even believe. But that's a story for another day.